May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, and our freedom. Amen. That's a wonderful hymn we just sang. Yesterday, I received an email from a new friend in the United Kingdom saying that All Saints Church might want to learn a new hymn called When IRS Eyes Are Smiling. The Internal Revenue Service has come to church. It has come to church here at All Saints. The IRS has focused on the sermon preached by Rector Emeritus George Regas from this pulpit the Sunday before the last presidential election. The IRS claims that the sermon violated IRS regulations against campaign intervention, despite the fact that George Regas explicitly stated that he was not advising anyone to vote for either presidential candidate. In fact, he acknowledged that good people of deep faith would be voting for President Bush and good people of deep faith would be voting for Senator Kerry. Since this past June, All Saints has been in conversation with the IRS about this matter. Our attorneys in a Washington, D.C. tax firm have been speaking on our behalf. The IRS offered to drop the inquiry if we would admit that we had violated the tax regulations and promised never to do so again. This is going to be a good sermon. We refused on the grounds that All Saints has done nothing wrong. Furthermore, over the years, we have consistently worked within the IRS regulations. Regulations we happen to consider to be healthy for our democracy and which we believe protect that precious principle of freedom of speech and the precious principle of freedom of religion. The case has now been taken from the level of the field office in Des Moines, Iowa, to a regional investigator, and we are awaiting their findings. Long ago, God called All Saints Church to teach and preach Jesus' core values of inclusion, of compassion, healing, environmental justice, peacemaking, and economic justice. This church invites everyone to embody those values in the political arena of life. This includes sometimes critiquing policies which violate those core values. We must always conduct our social action from a nonpartisan perspective. That is why we have criticized the policies of both President Bush and Senator Kerry. That is why we critique both the executive and the legislative branches of government for perpetuating this unjust, immoral war by their refusal to develop an exit strategy that brings an end to the killing of both Iraqi and American lives and the increase of terrorism in the Middle East and throughout the world at the price tag of more than $1 billion a week. That is why we endorse the efforts of both Democratic Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey and Republican Congressman Walter Jones, who have jointly called for the development of an exit strategy from Iraq. That is why we endorse the efforts of Republican Senator John McCain to put an end to U.S.-sponsored torture. Our nonpartisanship is a holy space from which we can, without obligation or allegiance to any party or person, bring the core values of our faith to bear on the institutions and culture around us, remembering that faith without works is dead, and that we are called to be doers of the word, not hearers only. Faith in action is called politics. Spirituality without action is fruitless, and social action without spirituality is heartless. We are boldly political without being partisan. Having a partisan-free place to stand liberates the religious patriot to see clearly, speak courageously, and act daringly. All Saints is energetically resisting the IRS's interpretation of the IRS regulations. The IRS is arguing that they can investigate a church based on a field officer's subjective determination that a preacher's sermon implicitly opposes or endorses candidates, regardless of the explicit statements of the preacher. This means that any sermon which states a church's core values, when proclaimed during an election season, can be subjectively deemed to be campaign intervention. If this IRS interpretation stands, that means that a preacher cannot speak boldly about the core values of his or her faith community without fear of governmental recrimination. And in our case at All Saints, that means that a preacher cannot, without fear of governmental recrimination, speak boldly about the value of promoting peace if the nation happens to be at war during an election season. But the Bible tells us to preach the word in season and out of season. And I can't find in the Bible any exception for the election season. There is no season when a believer should refrain from calling the government to develop an exit strategy from an immoral war, which has now taken the lives of over 2,000 U.S. soldiers, tens of thousands of Iraqis, which rewards corporations without any accountability, takes away civil liberties, sets up ghost torture centers, sets Christian against Muslim, and paired with tax cuts for the super wealthy, steals food from the poor and steals schools and health care from children. No wonder we at All Saints have this week received a surprising outpouring of solidarity and support from a host of other believers across the dividing lines of the culture wars. Support from Jews and Muslims, Buddhists and Hindus, from First Amendment attorneys and scholars, and from heads of secular nonprofit and non-governmental organizations. An evangelical Christian radio show host told me during an interview Friday, "Pastor, if they are coming for you now, they will be coming for us next." We are all remembering those dark days in history when religious people thought it was not spiritual to get involved in social action and politics, and so remained quiet. A Christian pastor, Martin Niemöller, after he was released from Dachau, ended all of his sermons in this way. First, they came for the communists, and I was not a communist, and I didn't speak up. Then they came for the labor organizers, and I was not a labor organizer, and I didn't speak up. And then they came for the Jews, and I was not a Jew, so I didn't speak up. And then they came for me, but there was no one left to speak up. In many ways, I am grateful that the IRS has come to church at All Saints, because both people of faith and people who do not profess a faith are coming together at this important moment in our history to hold up something essential in a democracy, the separation of church and state. There is something bigger at stake here than All Saints. What is at stake is that precious, holy freedom from intimidation. When religious leaders enter this sacred place called a pulpit, the only voice a preacher needs to be heeding when he or she is in this pulpit is the voice of God's Spirit speaking to the human conscience. And in order for that mystical transaction to take place in this pulpit freely, there must be no fear of incrimination, that a value-filled sermon will be subjectively deemed to be a partisan-filled endorsement. So I'm grateful that the IRS has come to church at All Saints, so that we can express before the world without fear the principles of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. The IRS agents are welcome in our pews. They are not welcome in our pulpit. Jesus told a great parable so applicable this morning. It is a parable about the paralyzing effects of fear. It is a parable calling for love-based risk-taking rather than fear-based playing it safe. In Jesus' story, 3 people are given great sums of money to manage while a rich man is away on a journey. 2 stewards took that with which they were entrusted and invested it so that they doubled the value of the sums they were given. The 3rd dug a hole and buried the money in the ground, which of course resulted in nothing gained. When the landowner returned, he praised the first 2 and called the 3rd worthless and lazy. The 3rd played it safe with his gifts because he was afraid. We have been given many gifts. We must not bury them, be quiet about them, or play it safe with them. We have been given the gift of knowing God to be a loving God rather than a wrathful, punitive God. There is no need for fear in life because we know God to be a loving, forgiving, nurturing, and inclusive God rather than a condemning God. There are 2 competing attitudes for the face of Christianity in America today. There is the attitude of inclusiveness, compassion, forgiveness, justice, and peace, rooted in the house of love rather than the house of fear. And people who know this God are largely free and imaginative, courageous, risk-taking, and visionary. There is the competing attitude of punishment, condemnation, terrorism, and wrath. And people who fabricate a God like this are often adaptive and resentful, who out of anxiety in their life want a risk-free theology and a risk-free society that will always guarantee their safety and security. Jesus himself had to deal with these competing attitudes about God. In the 1st century, in the face of a punitive, condemning Roman Empire and its occupation of Jesus' homeland, and in the face of religious leaders who had become the empire's catechists, evangelists, and acolytes, always interested in drawing lines of division between rich and poor, sinner and righteous, Gentile and Jew, male and female, slave and free, Jesus drew a circle of unconditional love around them all. He called people to community, as we do here at All Saints. Jesus was constantly feeding them from the table of community and always bringing children into the center of the circle. That is why going to church is so important for us. We come to gather in community and feel and experience that power that is based in love, not fear. Jesus was never afraid to break down the dividing walls that oppressed the victims of imperialism of his day. No wonder people flocked to him, for in that force field there was joy. There was healing of old wounds. There was unconditional acceptance. There was a sense of whoever someone was and wherever they were on their journey, they were welcome. And Jesus was never afraid to stand up to the religious and political elites. We cannot bury this gift in the ground of fear. We must risk this precious gift God has given us to our faith community. People of faith all over this country must risk this precious gift of God as a God of love, so that all Americans can be free to express their conscience, whether it agrees with our government or not. It is only in freedom that we can find truth, and the truth is always a power that sets us free. A second gift we've been given is what Jesus called neighbor love. He said, love God with all your being and your neighbor as yourself. And then he told another story illustrating that God's definition of neighbor is not someone who lives in your zip code. Your neighbor is anyone who has been beaten and is lying in the ditch of life. Your neighbor is anyone who needs you to be neighbor to them. Your neighbor is a child in America underserved by our society. Your neighbor is a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay without due process. Your neighbor is someone in what is now known as black sites in Eastern Europe, where ghost detainees are subject to unknown interrogation methods. Your neighbor is a civilian in Fallujah who is suffering from illegally dropped white phosphorus incendiary bombs. Your neighbor is someone in Darfur who is living in a refugee camp, fearful of no food, fearful of being raped tonight, fearful of helicopters swirling above. Jesus went so far as to say that when you are neighbor to the least of these in the human family, you have done that act of mercy or justice or peacemaking to Jesus himself. You have done it to God. What a gift. We cannot bury that gift in the ground for fear just because the IRS has come to church. The last gift I'm going to mention is the gift the prophets gave us almost 3,000 years ago. It is the gift of speaking truth to power. The prophet Nathan said to the powerful King David, "You are the man." Jeremiah and Isaiah and Amos and Hosea said to their rulers and the false prophets who were the chaplains for those rulers, "You must stop the injustice. You must stop the violence and oppression in our land." And in our time, in the 21st century, you and I have been entrusted with this same gift of speaking truth to power. What a gift. We cannot bury that gift in the ground of fear just because the IRS has come to church. We must raise our voices without fear and with fierce tenacity until this war stops, until this torturing stops, and until this genocide in Darfur stops. We are happy that the IRS goes to church. We are happy to have the IRS go to church at All Saints Church. When the IRS goes to church, we want them to know that our mission is not so much to work to get to heaven, but to work to get heaven to earth. And what we will resist, at All Saints Church with all our might is all infringements on freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and any suggestion that we tamper the proclamation of God as the God of love rather than God of fear. We will resist with all our might a call not to proclaim the love of neighbor in season and out of season. And we will protest and resist any efforts of the government coming into the pulpits of our land with a call to reverse a 3,000-year-old prophetic vocation to speak truth to power. In the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, today is a time for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. Amen.